Welcome to the Pencil Bob channel. I hope you enjoy my stories.
When I moved into my suburban neighborhood, I thought I was stepping into a slice of the American dream. A peaceful, well-kept community where neighbors waved hello and barbecues happened every weekend. Instead, I stumbled into a fiefdom ruled by Todd, our HOA president. Calling Todd a leader is generous. He was more like a wannabe king, drunk on power but allergic to the responsibilities that came with it. His leadership style? Dictatorial at best, laughably hypocritical at worst. He'd fine you $200 if your trash cans were out past 9:01 a.m. But his own garbage bins? They'd linger at the curb for days. Rules that inconvenienced Todd, magically overlooked. Rules that inconvenienced everyone else, enforced with military precision. Todd's yard was a clear display of his arrogance. Unpermitted sheds dotted the landscape like a junkyard collection, and his fence, taller than the legal limit, loomed over the neighborhood like a middle finger to city ordinances. Everyone knew he was breaking the rules, but most people were too intimidated or too apathetic to challenge him. And then there was the money. Oh, the money. Todd treated HOA funds like his personal slush fund. New streetlights? Nope. Landscaping maintenance? Forget about it. But somehow, the HOA managed to cover a series of questionable business expenses, including a brand new grill that mysteriously ended up on Todd's patio. My first run-in with Todd came over my fence. Literally, when I moved in, I stained it with the closest match I could find to the HOA-approved color. The exact stain wasn't available. Supply chain issues, thanks to the pandemic. I figured a slight variation wouldn't be a big deal. I was wrong. Todd hit me with a $500 fine faster than you could say overreach. I wasn't just frustrated, I was floored. This was my first home, a place I wanted to cherish and invest in. And here was this self-appointed tyrant nitpicking over a fence stain. I tried reasoning with him. I gathered receipts, explained the situation, and politely asked for leniency. His response? A smirk and 4 words I'll never forget. Rules are rules. That's when it clicked for me. Todd didn't care about the rules. He cared about control. His smirk wasn't just condescension. It was a challenge, daring me to push back. And push back I would. Not with yelling matches or passive-aggressive notes. I was going to dismantle Todd's little kingdom the only way he wouldn't see coming. Methodically, legally, and with precision. He'd regret ever wielding those rules like a weapon, because this time, they were going to turn on him. Todd's first mistake was underestimating me. He saw me as just another homeowner too beaten down or apathetic to challenge his reign. But I had a plan, a long game. I volunteered for the HOA board, flashing a friendly smile and saying all the right things about wanting to get involved in the community. Todd, ever eager to have another pawn on his chessboard, welcomed me with open arms. What he didn't know was that I wasn't there to follow his lead. I was there to watch, listen, and gather everything I needed to take him down. I played the role of the eager, naive newcomer perfectly. For 2 years, I attended every meeting, kept my mouth shut, and absorbed every detail of Todd's operation. It wasn't hard to see how he maintained control. Todd ruled the board through intimidation and manipulation. He'd browbeat members into submission, belittle their suggestions, and drown them in so much paperwork they'd give up before they even got started. His allies, a small, loyal group of yes men, always showed up in force to meetings. Anytime an important vote came up, Todd made sure his cronies were the only ones in the room. If a dissenting homeowner submitted paperwork, like a request to dispute a fine or appeal a violation, Todd would misplace it with a smug grin. It was like watching a bad movie villain in real life. And yet, I stayed quiet. I nodded along when Todd spoke, acted overwhelmed by the complexity of the bylaws, and even laughed at his lame jokes. All the while, I was taking notes. Meticulous, detailed notes. Every shady vote, every suspicious decision, every complaint that mysteriously vanished. I documented it all, biding my time until I could use it. My original goal was simple: outlast Todd's term as president. I figured if I could keep my seat on the board long enough, I'd have the chance to undo some of the damage he'd done. But then I stumbled upon Todd's second mistake, and everything changed. You see, Todd wasn't just a bully with a god complex. He was a thief. It started with a casual comment from another board member about how the HOA's budget never seemed to add up. Intrigued, I began digging through financial records. Todd didn't make it easy. In true Todd fashion, The records were a mess, with missing receipts, vague expense descriptions, and miscellaneous charges that raised every red flag imaginable. One charge in particular caught my eye, a $1,200 payment for community equipment that didn't seem to exist. That's when it hit me. Todd wasn't just abusing his power to make everyone's lives miserable. He was lining his own pockets. The petty dictator wasn't content with controlling the neighborhood. He wanted to profit from it too. I knew then that waiting out his term wasn't enough. Todd needed to go, and I was going to make sure it happened. Todd loved to brag about how he kept the HOA's finances in perfect order. He'd puff his chest out at meetings and assure everyone that their fees were being well spent. But as time went on, something didn't add up. The annual HOA fees were sky high, much higher than similar neighborhoods in the area. But the common areas were crumbling. The pool, a supposed community perk, was closed for maintenance half the summer. The landscaping looked neglected, overgrown, and forgotten. It was clear that the money was going somewhere, but it sure wasn't into maintaining the neighborhood. So, I started digging. As the HOA treasurer, Todd had full access to all the accounts. He was also the one who approved budgets and expenses, but he was notoriously cagey about sharing financial details. The more I asked, the more evasive he became. At a board meeting, I casually asked for the current budget, expecting him to hand it over without much fuss. Instead, Todd laughed it off and said, "Don't worry, I've got it under control," brushing me off like I was a child. That didn't sit right with me. Determined to get answers, I filed a formal request for the HOA's financial records. Under HOA rules, he was required to provide them upon request. Weeks went by, and still no response. I was getting frustrated, but I wasn't about to back down. That's when I started talking to my neighbors. To my surprise, I wasn't the only one who had grown suspicious of Todd's handling of the HOA funds. Over a dozen homeowners had requested access to the budget over the years, only to be ignored. One neighbor even claimed that Todd had used HOA money to install a new patio at his house. Another neighbor swore he'd seen Todd's kids hanging out at the community pool during its maintenance closure. Armed with these stories, I filed a formal complaint with the HOA board, demanding that Todd provide the records. Todd stalled as much as he could, but I wasn't backing down now. Not after everything I had uncovered. When Todd finally handed over the financial documents, it was clear he'd been hoping I'd give up. The records were a chaotic mess, nothing like the well-organized, transparent documents he'd always claimed he kept. Invoices were missing, payments were mislabeled, and some expenses were downright bizarre. For example, there was a $15,000 landscaping fee paid to a company that didn't even exist. Another line item listed thousands spent on administrative costs, but there was no explanation of what those costs were for. I could feel the weight of the evidence building against him, but I wasn't going to jump to conclusions just yet. I meticulously cross-referenced the HOA's bank statements with public records and official documents. That's when I found it, the smoking gun. A pattern began to emerge that made my stomach turn. Todd wasn't just bad at keeping records. He was funneling HOA money into his own personal accounts. The more I dug, the more I found. But there was more. Much more. I discovered that Todd had been inflating contractor fees, pocketing the difference, and splitting the profits with his buddy, a shady contractor who handled most of the HOA's maintenance work. This contractor was the same guy who supposedly maintained the landscaping, fixed the pool, and repaired the neighborhood fences. But somehow, none of those jobs were ever completed to any reasonable standard. The more I pieced it together, the clearer it became. Todd had been using the HOA as his own personal ATM. I wasn't about to let this slide. I compiled everything into a comprehensive report, with spreadsheets breaking down every financial discrepancy, photos of the contractor's subpar work, and notarized statements from neighbors who had witnessed Todd's antics firsthand. I made sure the report was airtight, every detail accounted for, and every piece of evidence perfectly organized. This wasn't just about getting Todd out of office anymore. It was about holding him accountable for the theft he'd committed. And when the time came, I'd make sure he couldn't weasel his way out. I bided my time, waiting for the annual HOA meeting to arrive. Normally, these meetings were a snooze fest, with only a handful of homeowners showing up. But this time, I had a different plan. For weeks, I knocked on doors, casually bringing up Todd's shady behavior. I didn't lay it all out at once, just enough to get people curious and, more importantly, angry. By the time the meeting rolled around, the room was packed, a rarity in our community. Todd kicked things off as usual, droning on about how difficult it was to manage the HOA, how much sacrifice he'd made for the neighborhood, and how he was just trying to keep everything in order. It was his typical self-congratulatory speech, but I was done with his nonsense. I stood up, calm and collected, and asked Todd, "Can you explain the discrepancies in the budget?" His nervous laugh told me everything I needed to know. "I don't think this is the time or place for that," he said, trying to brush me off. I didn't back down. "Actually, Todd," I said, "this is the perfect time." With that, I handed out copies of my report to everyone in the room. There was no grand speech, no need for theatrics. The evidence spoke for itself. As people began reading, the room went silent at first. Then whispers started. The whispers grew louder, turning into angry shouts as they realized just how deep Todd's corruption ran. Todd tried to regain control, but it was like trying to hold back a tidal wave with a bucket. The damage had been done. I didn't waste a moment. I called for a vote to remove Todd as president. It was swift and decisive. By the end of the night, Todd was out, and just like that, his little reign of terror came to an end. Once Todd was removed from office, we wasted no time bringing in an independent auditor to sift through the HOA's finances. The results were worse than I'd even anticipated. The auditor confirmed what we'd suspected all along. Todd had embezzled over $50,000 from the HOA. On top of that, he'd mismanaged tens of thousands more and committed multiple counts of fraud. The evidence was undeniable, and we weren't going to let him slip away. We reported him to the police and filed a civil lawsuit to recover the stolen funds. But the fallout didn't stop there. Todd's shady contractor buddy, the one who'd been helping him siphon off money for years, was also exposed. Turns out, this guy wasn't just complicit in the embezzlement. He was running a racket of his own. After an investigation, he was banned from doing business in the county altogether. His name was Mud, and no one would touch him professionally again. As for Todd, the consequences kept piling up. His reputation was in ruins. He had to sell his house to pay restitution and legal fees, and even that wasn't enough to cover the damage he'd done. He became a running joke in the neighborhood. Whenever someone mentioned his name, people couldn't help but laugh bitterly. His own downfall was the punchline to every conversation about HOA corruption. With Todd gone and the neighborhood slowly recovering, we took steps to ensure something like this would never happen again. We restructured the entire HOA, putting safeguards in place to prevent another power-hungry dictator from ever seizing control. We implemented term limits for board members, mandated that multiple members approve financial decisions, and created an online portal so every homeowner could access budgets and meeting minutes. Transparency was now the rule, not the exception. And in the end, it wasn't just about taking Todd down. It was about making sure no one else could ever abuse the system again. Every time I walk past Todd's old house now, which is owned by a lovely family, I can't help but smile. The pool is open and functioning, the landscaping is lush and well-maintained, and the HOA fees have never been lower. It's a stark contrast to the eyesore it used to be under Todd's reign. The neighborhood finally felt like it was thriving again, the weight of his corruption lifting from its shoulders. As for Todd, his story didn't have a happy ending. After his fall from grace, he moved to a neighboring town. Rumor has it, he tried to join another HOA board, eager to regain some semblance of power. But when someone Googled his name, the reaction was immediate. He was laughed out of the room. No one wanted to touch him, not after everything he'd done. It was the ultimate humiliation. His reputation, once a source of pride, had been utterly destroyed. Justice wasn't just served, it was plated, garnished, and savored. Watching Todd's downfall unfold was satisfying, not because it was about revenge, but because it was about setting things right. The neighborhood had finally gotten the leadership it deserved, and Todd, he was left with nothing but the consequences of his own greed. I really hope this is true, honestly, as someone who ran a co-op board managing 350 units. Nothing was more exhausting for me than board members who did selfish things. Not theft, but completely self-serving decisions. It was so exhausting, I sold my unit and left. So I want to believe someone got this sort of revenge. I want to say, we're not all bad on the board. I tried my best to make good decisions, out of hard choices. Do you fix the not-to-code elevators? Or fix the roofs? Eventually, what happens is the best to run such a large complex become exhausted and quit, like I did and several friends, and then the lunatics have full reign. Crazy or selfish, wear you out. 2 crazy points that stood out to me. Todd saying, "This isn't the time or place," when confronted about the shady financials. Isn't an HOA meeting time and place for that, categorically? The fact that the criminal contractor didn't have his business dissolved for that. Like, it's insane that he can still do work anywhere outside the county. Some great justice system we have. As a person who's never lived in the USA, I am often very confused on why things such HOA are even a thing. The closer we get to this in my country is some rules regarding public shared spaces if you live in a gated community or building, but never regarding your own private property. It's a wild concept for me that an association can tell you what you can or cannot do with your own house.
I would like to thank you for watching the video to the end. To encourage us to make more videos, please like, subscribe, comment, as well as share. Check out this other video if you haven't already.